Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be here today. Thank you, Eric, and your support system for inviting me here today. It's really an honor to spend some time at Orange Coast College and share a little bit about my work. I'm really excited about pedagogy, what we can do in the classroom to help boost student success. And I've been really engaged in this issue for over 20 years as a researcher and as a teacher, as an instructor who's really committed to blurring the lines between what we do in higher education and the communities that we serve. And so with that, what I thought we can do today is I want to talk a lot about pedagogy. What is pedagogy? Pedagogy is more, most in a more straightforward definition is how we teach. But it's not as simple as that. I mean, someone could say, I'm standing up here lecturing, so my pedagogy or my pedagogical approach is lecturing. But it's also about relationships. It's largely about relationships. And it's about equity. It's about access. It's about opportunity. It's about the ways that students work with educators and one another to construct knowledge. And what I've been spending the last 20 years or so in my career is trying to understand various approaches to pedagogy and how we can use those in the classroom to really transform the classroom space. And what I thought I'd share with you today are about 4 strategies that I've used, I've published about, I've shared, that other institutions have picked up on and have used to help engage students. So we're going to talk about educational journeys and what I call corazón pedagogy. We're going to talk about mochila or backpack pedagogy, cariño pedagogy or a pedagogy of care, and then espejo pedagogy or the role of the mirror in education. Who's a student? Raise your hand if you're a student. And how about a staff member? And faculty? And in a leadership capacity? Great. So it's any alumni from OCC also in here? Okay. I'm also a huge advocate of the community college systems. I'm a product of the community college systems. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my own journey in a second. Before I share a little bit about my own journey, I want us to think about 2 metaphors that I use in education. The metaphor of the mirror and the metaphor of the mochila, or the backpack. And I've appreciated over the years of using metaphors to help understand, to help communicate, to help connect people with concepts that we like to read about and theorize in higher education. So I'm going to integrate these 2 metaphors throughout my presentation today, okay? So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and you can chat with a neighbor if you're inspired to do so. But these questions are very relevant to students, to staff, to faculty, to leadership. So here's the first question before we jump in. What kinds of things do you do? This is more faculty facing. What kinds of things do you do to introduce yourselves to students in the classroom? And if you're a student, what kinds of things have your professors done to introduce themselves to you? Or have they? Think about that for a second. Does anything jump out? Does anybody want to share what they do as a faculty member or what they've seen their professors do to introduce themselves on the first day of class, for example? Has anyone experienced that or practiced that?
So I've had the pleasure of having Dr. Drew as one of my professors in the past. And one of the things that he liked to do was to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is a hero for him. Mm-hmm. And then this isn't really like in the beginning of the semester, but he did bring it up as well. But more towards the end, he ended the class by giving us a speech of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which I thought was very impactful. At least for me it was. I don't know if it was for anybody else, just to understand that this was his hero, and he spoke about it in the beginning, and then we walked through American government with him together through a whole semester, and then I did the Clio cohort together, so everything tied in together very nice, and then just to have that at the end, it was like the cherry on top. I loved it.
Good. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm really blushing. You just have to.
Yes.
So I'm a professor, and one of the things I really like to do is to play music. And since I love hip hop, a lot of times I play hip hop at the beginning, the first day, but also beginning almost every class, I play music that I enjoy. And I also try to authentically be myself as an African American woman, and also as a former community college student. That's my go-to to share with them that I sat right there. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I do similar. I play a lot of music at the beginning of my classes. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to demonstrate what I call educational journeys, or a corazón pedagogy, a pedagogy of the heart. And I do this, what you're about to see is something that I do on the first day of every class. Undergrads, master's students, teacher ed students, PhD students, talking to parents in the community, working with educators and teachers, spaces like this. I usually share a little bit about my own educational journey as a pedagogical practice to show my students or show my audience who I am and where I'm coming from and why I teach what I teach, and why I'm passionate about what I am committed to doing in education. Actually, I should have tested the, let's see if the audio works. Who's that? Who's that? There you go. So what I call myself is an Inland Empire Chicano, Mexican American, right? And this is my educational journey. And so if you were to look and follow my educational trajectory, everybody hear me okay? You'll see that I went to Colton High School. You all heard of Colton, right? Next to San Bernardino. Then I went to San Bernardino Valley College for 2 years. After that, I transferred to Cal State San Bernardino, became a psychology major and a McNair Scholar. Then I went to an internship at Harvard while I was an undergrad and got plugged in to this institution. Later went to grad school there, and then started my career at FIU in Miami. And then in 2009, I had an opportunity to come home. I knew I would come back to California, but I also knew that in academia, you might not always get to pick the institution. As those of you that are professors, it's a very competitive out there to be a professor in any field. So I knew I would come back to California. I don't know where, but I was grateful enough to have this opportunity to come back to my alma mater. I came back to Cal State. And then in 2016, I secured a position at Riverside. And I've been there ever since. But this is what you would see in my bio, on a resume, on Google search, right? This is standard stuff. What you don't see is my family. Here's a picture of me and my parents, 1976 or so. That was our first home, which was a garage, converted to our first home. My parents were very young parents. They were 20 when they had me. No higher education. My dad worked with his hands his whole life and just retired a few years ago. My parents are just gonna celebrate their 50th anniversary this Saturday. So we're basically having a wedding that my brothers and I are planning this Saturday. But this is a picture of me and my parents. You don't see that on my resume, but they're the foundation of who I am. All the hard work, all of the sacrifice, everything they taught me about being committed to your familia, to your community, came from my family. My city, where I was born in San Bernardino, if you've ever been there, you'll see the Santa Fe whistle. And Colton is where I was raised, right next door. Mentors are huge. No one ever does it because they're smart or they just worked harder than everybody else. It takes some of that, absolutely. But mentors in our lives, make a lot of the difference and sometimes all of the difference. People like Eric, people like the professors in this room and the staff and the leadership. Mentors matter, right? And for me, Laura Gomez, my community college advisor, was one of my first mentors who showed me the way. And here I just wanted to share a picture of her because you're not going to see her on my resume necessarily, but she was vital to my educational journey. History and ancestors. There's a newspaper in the Inland Empire region called El Chicano. It's been around for decades. And it's a local newspaper where people got together and said, we need to tell the news from the Chicano perspective. And I've always been aware of this publication, but about 5 or 6 years ago, I was at my cousin's house for a Labor Day celebration. And one of my aunts, one of my tias, she was like, hey, mijo, you got to go look at the photo album over there. And I was like, why? She says, there's a newspaper article about our tia Bernie. So here's 1982, El Chicano newspaper, Casa Ramona, 10 years of service. These 3 people are being celebrated at this event, and it's Cruz Reynoso, the first Chicano Supreme Court Justice in California, Cesar Chavez from United Farm Workers, everybody knows Cesar Chavez. Chavez Day is at the end of the month. And then my tia Bernie. Why is she being recognized next to these 2 giants in California and U.S. history, right? Well, it turns out that in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, she was a huge community advocate for the Mexican American community. It turns out that the city wouldn't pick up the trash with any frequency. They wouldn't build sidewalks in the Mexican American community. So she mobilized the community to say, we're homeowners. We should get sidewalks. You should pick up our trash like you pick up everybody's trash. So she started organizing the community and became a huge advocate. She passed away when I was very young, so I didn't get a chance to learn from her directly. But when I think about my own educational journey, I think about my tia Bernie because she paved the way to make it possible for people like me, family or not, to persist in education, have a pathway in education. And so I feel like that's a very important part of my own legacy or my own history and what's influenced me to get to where I am today. So when I think about now away from me, and I just think about students in general, and especially students who have been historically marginalized in our society, I think about little kids going to school every day. Little brother and little sister getting their backpacks, getting ready in the morning. Their parents are getting them out the door. They're walking to the bus stop, and they're going to school. And without saying so explicitly, what do you have for me? What do you, as the school system, what do you have for me? I showed up. What are you going to do for me? And when I think about what students bring in their backpacks, and I'm going to talk a little bit more on mochila pedagogy next, but when I think about what I bring to the classroom space is family, culture, community, our ancestors, language, history, people. So this is something that if you think about pedagogy in the classroom, how far this goes with students. Students then see me, they know a lot more about me. And I'm only comfortable sharing what I shared. And I ask the same thing of other professors. If other professors are interested in doing this, only share with what you're comfortable. And maybe start small. Maybe you start with one image. Hey, this picture is really important to me. This is my, this is my favorite vacation spot. This is where I go mentally to decompress. And here's a picture of that space, right? Something like that. You only share with what you're comfortable sharing. And those of you that are aspiring educators or leaders in the community, you can do this in any space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. Why is this so important? Especially when, we serve communities who may have been marginalized in society. for various reasons. It could be race or ethnicity, it could be language, it could be gender, it could be disability, it could be a lot of different reasons. I think the context is key. And one of the things that I argue is that when these little kids are going to school and they look in the mirror, and the mirror represents the institution or education, my argument is that when they go to school, they should see their brilliance of who they are as people, their families, their community, their history, and their ancestors. The education system should deliver that to our students. That's what I would argue. Whether we're teaching them math, science, history, linguistics, bioengineering, our students should see themselves. They should see their brilliance, or they should be given opportunities to see their brilliance. Does that make sense? But there are some things that are preventing that from happening. I argue, and this is important, that there's smoke in front of that mirror. The smoke is made up of all kinds of different things. And so what ends up happening is a lot of our students develop a distorted view of who they are. It's blurry. It's unclear. It might be false. What I call the reflejo falso that a lot of our students develop. They develop a false sense of who they are. They could even get a PhD. Hopefully they can get that far. And have a false sense of who they are. It's our responsibility as educators to show them their brilliance in whatever context that is or whatever subject area that is. Unfortunately, that smoke is made up of historical injustices. It's made up of cultural erasure. Just open up any textbook. And who's not represented in those textbooks? Damaging policies, discrimination and exclusion, an overemphasis on testing. We've seen this in the K-12 system over the last 20 years. Low expectations, zero tolerance policies. We see that in the K-12 system as well. The silencing of students or communities. Deficit thinking. You see where I'm going with this. There are lots of things that make up this smoke and that prevent the students from seeing their brilliance. But I'm not pessimistic enough to think that it has to be that way. Pedagogy matters. Pedagogy can help us swipe away the smoke. And I use smoke because smoke is temporary. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, talks about limit situations. That there are always limits to injustice, whatever that looks like, in any society, any culture, any institution. And I believe the same thing, that these realities are not permanent. And as educators, we have the power to help. We might not be able to change a lot of this stuff, but we can create humanizing experiences in our classrooms, right? And there's so many others. Irrelevant curriculum, absent relationships. So how do we clear that smoke? So educational journeys. Over time, I've developed this notion of educational journeys, the one I just shared about myself, to what I call a corazon pedagogy. It takes heart. It takes courage to tell your story. It takes passion. It takes risk. We don't know how our students are going to respond to our journeys. And a lot of times, sometimes we just share with whatever you're comfortable sharing. But I call it corazon pedagogy. It's an educational practice that centers the educator's journey as the starting point for creating a culture of belonging in the classroom, authentic engagement, and high quality teaching and learning. So how can you do this? Where do you start? You can identify 3 formative educational moments in your own journey that impacted you. Positive, negative. Maybe it started off negative and resulted in positive. Maybe it's something from, high school, or an amazing 8th grade teacher you had, or a transformative community college professor you had. But tell the story. When, where, who. Why does this moment stand out? And use photos, use art, use music, use artifacts. There's another practice that doesn't use PowerPoint. There's a strategy called Bag About Me. And you get a big paper bag from like the supermarket and you fill it up with artifacts, things that are important to you. So like for me, I would put a basketball in it because basketball is important to me. I played, I've coached, my kids play. You would have a picture of my family. But you can, on the first day of class, if you don't want to use PowerPoint, you can have a bag up here, fill it up with a bunch of artifacts, pull out each item, share it. It's just another approach. Start small, but take time to share your story. I think one of the things that I get pushback on is we don't have time for that. We have very limited instructional time. So you want me to take 45 minutes of the first day of class? We got to go over the syllabus, I hear. True. But I think the investment on the front end goes a long ways for the rest of the semester or quarter. What I would argue is the Corazon pedagogy humanizes the educator. You now know a lot more about me than when I walked in or what you heard about in my bio, right? It elevates the power of storytelling. It provides opportunity for connection between students and teachers. And even connect. As I was talking, did any of you connect with any small part of my journey?
La música.
La música. The music. Maybe it was family. Maybe it was a mentor. Maybe it was a couple of different things. Maybe your journey was totally different than mine, and that's okay. But that's what Corazon Pedagogy does. And I situate it in this circle between me as the pedagogue, the educator, looking in the mirror. Laura Rendon's work in the 90s called Validation. Validation in the classroom and the university. One of the things that she argues is students must be validated within the first 6 weeks of school. She puts a timeline on it. And she supported it through empirical research, data. And she says if students are validated in the first 6 weeks of school, they're going to make it. They're going to be okay. And they have to be validated by institutional agents, professors, staff, leadership, some variation of that. And so I have, if you're interested in reading more, Laura Rendon's work on validation is a really powerful resource to explore further. Here's another, take it even a step further. What if the professor, after they introduce themselves through their educational journey, assign students an assignment? Now go create yours. Right? It could be written, it could be artistic, it could be optional, it could be through PowerPoint. You can have volunteers come up in front of the classroom and share. Right? That takes it to another level of pedagogical practice. When students get up here and they become the pedagogue, right? The reciprocity of the teaching and learning dynamic is transformed at that point. Because then as the professor, you go sit down and the students are now teaching us, right? It's a really powerful practice. I've done loteria cards. You guys know the game Loteria? It's like a bingo in Spanish, kind of. You know, there are all these images with numbers, right? And people play this game. But we reconceptualized learning from one of a professor up at Sacramento State, shared this strategy with us. And we embed Loteria cards in our syllabus. So then every student in the classroom develops their own Loteria card based on their educational journey. So they have to depict their journey visually and decorate it. Colorful, whatever, however they want to do it. And then they there's a small narrative that they embed, but it has to be authentic to them. And that's their assignment. So there's so many different angles that you can take with this, aside from PowerPoint. So that's one, Corazon Pedagogy. Any questions or thoughts before we move on to the next one?
Doctor, case in point, what do you do when you have a situation like this? What do you do to get your students to open up?
Like in this moment now? I am comfortable with silence. And I tell my students that. I'll wait. And it's okay sometimes to sit in silence. And I respect it. Like I would never call on a student as part of my pedagogy. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Are you trying to hide? That's not my style. I respect the silence. I bet you if I handed out sticky notes, you guys would be writing and then turn them in, right? That's another strategy. So there's various ways. And then what I also do is I say, I noticed that only 3 of you always participate. I want you to know that I'm inviting all of you to participate in this class. And if you want to come talk to me in office hours about how to participate, come visit me. Let's talk. Little by little, students start coming. And then it's just opening up the space, right? Opening up the opportunity and saying, hey, come see me in office hours. Let's chat. You don't have to have a question or an agenda. Just come by. And then little by little, students start, and they're like, and a lot of times, one student told me they thought office hours was a time for professors to work in their office, so they should be bothered. I was like, no. So there's actually been a move to call them student hours, right? I don't know if you do that here. Student visiting hours. We got to think about that from a student perspective, right? Because I could see that logic, right? If they see office hours, it's like, yeah, don't bother the professor during their office hours. So that's Corazon Pedagogy, okay? Telling your journey, looking in the mirror as an educator. And you could be a first-year professor, you could be a 15th year, or I think someone said they've been here 24 years. You can practice this tomorrow, right? Next one, the next metaphor. Mochila pedagogy, or backpack. So I know you all know Dora, right? Dora the Explorer. I could share a resource with Eric. I just published a piece in PDK. It's an educator magazine, very short, and I call it Mochilas of Excellence, and I'll explain what that is. So Dora the Explorer. I have 4 kids. I think I've seen every episode. We own the DVDs and all of that. Dora's amazing. She's bilingual. She's culturally connected. She helps her family. She helps her grandma all the time. She saves little animals. She delivers her grandmother's baked goods to people. But she had that little backpack, that little mochila. And one day I was just sitting there thinking about the backpack. And I was like, wait a second, Dora had the little mochila, the little purple bag. And she had all kinds of stuff, rope, books, life jackets, and that little tiny thing, right? Whenever she needed, she's like, here we go, I'm gonna save the day. And so as I've been thinking about the mochila, it's very relevant to education, obviously. Most students here and educators, I mean, we all have some kind of backpack. Can we see beyond what's in there now? We all have, every fall, when do you start, August, September here? August. New students come in. I know I was always excited. Maybe a new backpack. But the stuff inside was often new. New pencils, a spiral notebook, maybe a learning device, a tablet, all the basic stuff. Pencils, glue for the little ones, right? Remember the glue? A ruler, scissors, right? All of these things. But what I argue is, what else do our students bring in their mochila? They bring so much more. So I wanted to ask you this question. If you don't mind participating, there's a QR code. What strengths, assets, or gifts do our students bring to us? And if you're a student, you can participate. What strengths do you bring to education? It's not going to identify who you are. So if you just take a second to enter, what strengths, assets do our students bring to us in the classroom? I know you're probably still typing if you're participating. You don't have to. Does anybody want to share some of the strengths, assets, skills our students bring to the classroom?
Sure. The last thing I was typing was knowledge. I just told my students the other day, I don't know, there's no way I can know everything, so I always learn something from them. They'll correct me sometimes or add on to something.
Yeah. That's a great point. Even acknowledging that we don't know everything. I think a lot of times they put us on a pedestal, like if we have an advanced degree, then we know everything or everything about our topic. And that's not the case, right? We're always learning.
I believe for good, I put it as the students bring their time, like they're giving their time to you, to, like willingly to listen to the educator of what they want to learn.
Their time, students provide their presence. It's a powerful position to be in as an educator, to have a group of students in front of you every day. And it's a gift for us, right? Because it's an opportunity for us to co-construct knowledge. Others?
Creative problem solving, so looking at things from a different perspective.
Absolutely. Creative problem solving. I think of Tara Yoso. She's a professor at Riverside in my department. She talks about community cultural wealth, right? And she argues that historically marginalized students bring all kinds of sources of wealth to education, but a lot of times those sources of wealth aren't recognized in the curriculum or on the exam or whatever. So one example she gives is navigational capital. An example is, how many of you can jump on a public city bus and get from here to the mall? Wherever that is, I don't know. Some of you that are students might know how to do that. You can put 5 PhDs on that bus, and it might be lost, right? But a lot of times, depending on where you grew up, how you grew up, what modes of transportation you had to rely on, you learn those things, like how to navigate systems, like the bus system. But it's not necessarily as simple as that. Sometimes we help our parents navigate the healthcare system. Even little kids, they have to translate for their parents. She calls that linguistic capital. How many of you had to translate for your parents? At the supermarket or at the post office or at the doctor's office, right? So she calls that linguistic capital. And she says, a lot of kids who are bilingual, they have that skill. How many times do we use that in the classroom as educators, right? That's what we mean by strengths, assets, skills, right? Knowing how to stretch a dollar. My mom was superb. I didn't really appreciate it at the time as a kid. I mean, I'm talking at McDonald's, we could all eat, 5 of us could eat for $19 back in the 80s. We're far from that now. But going to the supermarket, I remember being with my mom, and she's like, okay, we have $100, And we have to think about Monday through Friday. And she was like, okay, I'm going to buy this much ground beef. And she would walk us through it. Tacos, spaghetti, enchiladas, hamburgers, and then Friday we're going to go to McDonald's. That was a big thing when I was a kid. Growing up, the way I grew up, that was a huge treat. Watching her do that, I was like, okay, that's what we do every week, right? But growing up and thinking that way, you develop these skills. How can we incorporate that into the classroom space, right? These are some of the many skills that our students bring in their mochilas. So that exercise you just did was kind of, this is another way of doing the exercise. Another thing you can do is come up with a list of all the strengths and skills that your students have, and then have your students do the same exercise and then compare them and see where you were on point and where you fell short. Simple exercise you can do. Right? Just kind of comparing. And even doing it with different classes. Right? And kind of compare. How do students see themselves in this class versus that class? What are levels of confidence like? Does it depend on the topic area? If it's a heavy theoretical class, how are students feeling in your classroom? But these are just ways. So, the mochila pedagogy. How do we validate students? Here's one thing that I do in my current role that I have at UC Riverside. On the first day of orientation, if I have the opportunity to address the students, I tell them this: you belong here. Your families belong here, and your communities need you here. And it's just hearing that in and of itself, I think, is an important thing that Rendon teaches us. As I mentioned earlier, we can share our educational journeys with our students, connect the curriculum with the students, which can make learning relevant. And so, what does validation do? By validating what students bring in their backpacks, it promotes equity. It elevates students' voices in the classroom, and it acknowledges the skills and the rich assets that they bring. So when I think about the mochila, I think of these things that I mentioned earlier. Culture, history, ganas, right? This kind of desire to want to persist, this hunger. Language, community, families, resilience, determination, right? All of these things that our students bring. Overcoming adversity. Showing up every day that you mentioned earlier, right? These are all of the powerful things that our students bring. And how are we intentional as faculty in acknowledging those and possibly using those to strengthen the learning experience and promote validation in the classroom? Make sense? Any questions about any of this? So this is pedagogical practice number 2. So now we're going to move on to 3. The mirror, reflejo pedagogy. We're doing okay on time? Reflejo or reflection pedagogy. Now we're moving on to the mirror, okay? And here's the question I want us to think about especially as educators. I know there's students here. But what do we reflect back to our students when they look into the institutional or classroom mirror? What do we reflect back to them? So the students looking in the mirror, here we are at the institution. We're part of the institution, right, as educators. What are we reflecting back to them? Are we reflecting a more clear sense of who they are? Are we reflecting back knowledge? What does that knowledge consist of? In what ways do students see themselves in that mirror? Okay. through the music that you brought up, right? Through the story of Dr. King that was shared earlier, right? Through stories about who we are, what we're made up of, what influences us, why we do what we do. So you don't have to fill this out, but what strengths, skills, assets do you bring as faculty? So we talked about the students. Now as professors, as instructors, as leaders, what strengths, assets, skills do we bring to our students? So just take a second to think about that. You can write them down or put them in your notes. It'd be interesting to hear what you have to say. So what strengths do you bring as faculty, as leaders, as staff? Does any of our educators want to share?
For me, it's empathy and understanding. I feel like it's very important to recognize how you show up in a space and how you can show up for others.
Empathy and understanding, absolutely. Thank you.
My mistakes, and a little bit about errors I made, and consistent.
Thank you for saying that. You know, I for the first time, I publicly shared a struggle that I had professionally. And people came up to me after and they were like, thank you so much. Because people often think people's educational journeys are perfect or linear. No way. I could tell you stories of times I've been rejected by various opportunities that I thought I had in the bag, or mistakes along the way. Absolutely. Being transparent about that. I think that helps with, and I even hesitate to use these two words, imposter syndrome, that a lot of students share and feel. Can I do this? Can I study? Can I persist? Can I get a degree? Can I transfer? Can I transfer to UCLA? Can I transfer to UC Irvine? Self-doubt. Can I do it? Talking themselves out of things rather than talking themselves into things, right? It's important that we share those mistakes, those struggles, those bumps in the road, right? Most of our journeys are rarely just perfectly linear. You know, high school, college, life, job, life, right? All that. I'm going to buy a house, and I'm going to have a family, and then I'm going to do this. It's like, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, Dr. Green, I try to really be encouraging to my students, especially my students of ethnic backgrounds. I really encourage them to do things like research papers. The Latino students, for example, I encourage them to do research papers on Dolores Cesar Chavez, and people within their culture, and things like that. Also, to be proud of who you are. And another thing that I realized over the years, that I think I said earlier over here about, if you make a mistake, if you make a mistake in your syllabus, you have wrong test date or whatever, admit it. Like I tell my students, if I make a mistake, I screw up, guess who benefits? I'll correct it and you benefit. Okay?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That was a big step for me, teaching 30-something years.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing. And I think students are responsive to that because they want to feel that you're human and that you're approachable.
Absolutely. And that's part of what we're reflecting back to students. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to try and fail. It's okay to not know. Why am I in this class? Oh, is this going to help me be an accountant? Right? Or whatever you're studying to do. Whatever you're trying to do. A lot of times students might sit there and sometimes it's good to just step back and enjoy the ride. Enjoy the learning experience. Absorb it. Take it in. This is, for those of you that are just starting out your educational journeys in higher ed, I tell people who are starting PhDs, just enjoy. It's tough, but enjoy the moment, because this is going to be the last time it's a terminal degree. So after this, I mean, you're going to continue, you're going to always be a lifelong learner, but this is the last time you're going to be in a space where you're expected to be in the classroom learning, discussing, processing, writing, researching, all of that. Others, thank you for sharing that. Other educators, what do you bring?
I'm just gonna share this. I don't know that I accomplish it all the time, but I think it's important to try to create this kind of horizontal relationship in the classroom instead of a vertical one that invites, I try to be really humble in order to invite kind of students to feel comfortable speaking about, I teach high-risk topics like gender and race, and so I think like it's important when they don't kind of see a big power differential, and I'm very intentional about trying to kind of deconstruct that.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I think inviting students into the space, right, and contributing in that. I don't know everything, to your point earlier. As the professor, you're here to teach us something as well. You're here to teach your peers something. I'm going to learn from you. Sometimes just saying that to the students opens up, breaks down those barriers. One of the things that I also do halfway through my quarter is I put up 2 pieces of chart paper. I do it old school style. Chart paper, sticky notes, and I ask them 3 questions. What's going well? What needs to improve? And what strategies or suggestions do you have to improve your experience in this class for me? And I leave the room. And I let students 25 minutes. And they all put up their stickies, and then I come back in and we go through them. Anonymous. It's completely anonymous. Instead of an end of the quarter evaluation, it's a mid-quarter formative assessment, if you will. And it's an amazing experience for me to learn from the students, but it also begins to open up the dialogue there as well with the students, because they feel like I am honoring, validating, recognizing their voices in the classroom, that what they have to say matters. And sometimes it's critical, and I have to be able to take that, right? I asked for it. So that's another thing on pedagogy of validating the voices of students and their voices that they bring in their mochilas, their backpacks. And the knowledge that they bring as well, the experience that they bring as well. I'm not their first professor, most likely, right? So I'm always learning from what students have to bring and their assessment of my instruction. So let's go back to the mirror. Now this is going to be a little different. So before I was telling you on what makes up the smoke, all of those things that we know are detrimental. What I call, how do we develop the reflejo brillante, the brilliant reflection of our students? And so, again, the goal, the point, the role of education, in my view, you may view it differently, it's okay, should be for students, yeah, we want them to get a degree. They should learn how to read, write, do math, all the basic stuff, argue, speak, collaborate, right? That's what we learn in education. But education should also be about showing students their brilliance, allowing them to shine, providing opportunities for them to shine, of individuals, of our students as individuals, but also the extent to which we can incorporate their families, communities, history, ancestors. And so how do we do that? If you notice, the smoke's gone. Well, we know from research that equitable classroom policies matter. equitable institutional policies matter. What's an example of that? And I'm going to talk about this a little more in a second, but we learned a lot about this of empathy, to what you mentioned earlier, during the pandemic. Flexible policy. I mean, we were able to do as challenging, as grim that the pandemic was. What I learned is that we could make change in a moment's notice if we wanted to. Think about what we did overnight. Out of force, we had to. We had to pivot in days, doing things one way to doing things some totally different. Was it perfect? No. Did we learn a lot? Absolutely. But think about late assignments. How many of us have really strict policies on students submitting assignments late, and we start to deduct points? Someone might say, students need to learn how it is in the real world. You can't be late to work, so you got to have your assignments in on time. We're teaching them a lesson. Maybe, and if you run your classroom that way, that's how you do it. But I think what I've learned is I'm willing to provide second, third, fourth, fifth chances. If you want to be in my classroom, I'm going to do everything possible to make sure you get to the finish line. I was calling, and this was in 2019 before the pandemic, I was calling students on their whatever phone they had on record. Grades are due tomorrow, and you had a week to submit your assignment. It was due a week ago. What do I need to do to help you submit this assignment? I will take it. I'm submitting grades at 5. If you submit it to me by 4, I'll grade it and submit it. Students are, what? You're willing to do that? I gave up on this class. I will work with you. Let's make it happen. That's what I mean by equitable policies. For whatever reason, the student may have blew my class off. Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it later. I'll just take an incomplete, or I'll just take the F and I'll. But if you're willing to meet me somewhere, halfway, pick up the phone, respond to my email, I'll work with you. Is it easy? No. Can you do it with 105 students? It becomes challenging, right? We're also human. We got things to do. We got policies to meet. If I don't submit my grades, I get an email and a phone call from our student scheduling manager. Louis, grades were due last night. Because your name and your course and your school is on a report. And then your dean knows. Right? You don't want to be on that list. But that's what I mean by equitable policies. How far are we willing to go to institute these policies to clear away that smoke? Because again, there could be some things going on that we just can't fathom. Culturally relevant pedagogy. We know this matters. This is not new. To what extent does our curriculum reflect who our students are? Are they able to connect? Is it Dr. Drew mentioned earlier, right? Getting students to connect with people, with historical figures, with assignments that make some kind of connection with them, with their community, something that matters. In a lot of ways, it also opens the door and validates this as legitimate knowledge. It's just a lot of times it's not in standard curriculum. Our stories are not included in those. A lot of times it's not until higher ed, until we start to see ourselves reflected in the curriculum.
Can I say something
Yeah.
that requires a lot of courage and vulnerability? Because I want students to hear me say this, and I've never had to say it in an environment where there are students, but the policy you just outlined is very attractive to me, but I have fear about it because I have fear about what my colleagues will think of me. If they'll think I'm too soft, if they'll think I don't have rigor, if they'll think I'm not a good professor because I let students turn in late stuff. So I just want students to know, like, as a professional, this is something I have to negotiate with kind of how I view myself also. And it's something, this is kind of the second time I've heard it, and I'm very attracted to it. And then I always fall back at the beginning of the semester, like, I have to have these policies. I have to, you know, it can't be a pushover.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that out loud because it's almost making me want to cry.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know students who have 2 jobs and who are athletes and who are doing their very best. And to get something in on the time that works for me, because I have a 13-year-old and a family and I want to grade on this date, like that's my life. I structured that. That's not all the stuff they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No.
Thank you
Yeah.
for bringing it up and having this space so I could just say that out loud for the first time among students.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you for saying that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There is something about the culture of higher ed as well, right? Like you said, with our colleagues. How are they going to perceive us? How are they going to take that? During the pandemic, when we were pushing maximum flexibility with our students, I was a dean at the time. I had faculty who would come up to me and say, well, on Zoom, can we do that? Like they would, and authentically. And I had to process that as a leader, and then I would say, it's your classroom. You do whatever you're comfortable doing. I support you in whatever it is that you decide to do with regard to maximum flexibility. But that was a really interesting moment, right? Because you come from this culture in academia and higher education where there is that reality, right? Where we're surrounded by colleagues. We all have deans that oversee our departments, and there is a culture of rigor that we're expected to maintain. I would say this is rigor in a different way, right? Where we need to center empathy and the realities that we're facing, the context and then ultimately the students who we serve. I have 20 of these, but affirming culture, language, and history wipes away the smoke. High expectations and support wipes away the smoke. Meaningful relationships and connections wipes away the smoke. Pedagogies of love, to the point earlier about empathy. Engagement with families. I'm starting to see a really positive direction in higher ed where people are just much more attuned to the importance of families and loved ones, whoever that support network is for our students in higher ed, in welcoming them into the space in more intentional ways. Like even having Spanish language orientation for families. That is such a powerful, in this context, such a powerful practice, right? Just affirming people and who they are. So they understand, if they don't know English, they understand what their child is getting into. And I think, but historically in higher ed, it's like, okay, you're 18, 19 years old, come to Orange Coast College, and you're an adult. You're on your own, go for it. But if we welcome the family, it starts to create a different dynamic, right? And it's validating in a lot of ways. And it could be in Spanish, it could be in Vietnamese, it could be in Mandarin, it could be whatever the population, whatever language the population speaks. Learning over testing, pedagogies of the home. I mean, there's Dolores Delgado Bernal talks a lot about this. Cultural wealth is something I mentioned earlier. Ethnic studies. These all of these things wipe away the smoke. Pedagogy of the home, let me just say a little bit about that as a way of, again, reflecting back to our students who they are. Dolores Delgado Bernal, she's at LMU here in LA. She's coined this term to say that a lot of students who have come from historically marginalized backgrounds, come from cultures of rich storytelling, cuentos, dichos, stories or sayings are things that we hear growing up in our families, in our culture, from our grandparents. And she says we should incorporate those into the learning of our students in the classroom. How can we use those and validate those? It could be a really liberating opportunity for our students in their learning dynamic. You can Google her or just punch in Pedagogies of the Home on Google and you'll find articles on this topic. Community relevant curriculum. This is one of my favorites. This is kind of my thing. Kind of like my Tia Bernie. Kids in San Bernardino should be learning about my Tia Bernie, the one that I started off earlier, right? She used to advocate for the community, who was getting an award. Remember that? That was a long time ago. Kids in the community should be learning about people who are community relevant. Who's from this immediate area? I mean, think about ways that we could incorporate examples from the local community into our curriculum, right? Learn about them, read about them, study them. If the knowledge doesn't exist, how can our students help produce that knowledge? Right? And depending on what you teach. But that could be an assignment. They identified someone, but there's nothing written about them. There's nothing written about that person. How can the students go out in the community and find it? And they become the storytellers. They become the producers of knowledge. Funds of knowledge. Luis Moll, he actually just passed away this week. A scholar in education. I had the opportunity to meet him. But he came up with this term in the 90s called the funds of knowledge. That kids from marginalized backgrounds have the capacity to teach us something based on life experiences. And he gave it some language, calling it funds of knowledge. Again, if you Google funds of knowledge, you can find articles about this. So, we're coming here to the home run part. You heard of 3 pedagogies. When I think about the mirror, oftentimes our students, if you can just look here for a second, don't look over here, even though you're going to look over here because I said don't look over here. Just look here for a second. A lot of times when our students come to school and they look in the mirror, our identities are often shaped around our academic performance. Solely school and academics. I'm an A student. I'm a B student. I'm a 4, like K through 12, I performed at the proficient level, or I'm a 2, right? You remember those? That still happens today. I'm a perfect attendance student. We get awards for that. Citizenship award. My kids get those, right? For being good and being rule abiding, being a good friend. It's all good stuff. But a lot of times it's very narrow in the way that our education system and our kids are socialized from K through 12 all the way up to see themselves in the mirror solely through that academic lens. And their value as people are often narrowly defined that way. I'm an A student, or I'm just a C student. I can't transfer. What I'm arguing with the espejo pedagogy is that we have to see ourselves through multiple mirrors at the same time. So when I look in the mirror, I should see my school and academics, but I can also see my family because I bring that with me. The community strength that I bring, I can also see my brilliance. Just imagine if I'm standing here right now and I have 6 of you surrounding me with mirrors. You guys are actually holding mirrors. And they all have a label like this. When I look into one, I can see that one behind me reflected. Does that make sense? So you can see all of this happening at the same time. I'm arguing that this is where we need to go. Not just this, but all of this, right? Multiple mirrors, multiple reflections. So here's something to think about as a professor, as a classroom instructor. What is your classroom, pedagogy, curriculum, syllabus, assignments, the climate of your classroom? What does it reflect back to students? And do your students see themselves reflected? And how? In what ways do they see themselves reflected? We're engaged at UCR in a lot of syllabus revision work, where professors have opportunities to take a syllabus that they've used for 10 years. Maybe they've updated, every year they do some updates, but to really take a sweeping look and how are they engaged in inclusive pedagogy in terms of their policies, in terms of the language, in terms of the resources that are available, in terms of the content. And they're supported. There's people there's instructional designers that are assigned to this. But that's what this means, right? How are we taking a step back and assessing all of these things to reflect or understand what we're reflecting back to our students? Finally, all together, I talked about educational journeys, mochila pedagogy, espejo pedagogy. Now we're getting to cariño, a culture of care. That's what all of this means. Going back to what someone said earlier about empathy. How do we create this culture of care? If students know we care about them, and we learned this during the pandemic as well around wellness, right? Before it was academic services, mental health and wellness, and they were often parallel. I think what I've learned is that they have to be integrated. And I think with all of these kinds of practices together, help us build that culture of care, that cariño pedagogy. And I call this a call to action. I actually wrote a short piece in EdSource. If you punch in culture or if you punch in pedagogy of cariño in Google, you'll find an article I wrote during the pandemic. And it was largely on things like maximum flexibility as a way to show our students we care. So what is cariño pedagogy? It's an educational practice driven by care, love, and understanding. A genuine concern for students' well-being, exercising empathy and compassion, and high expectations. I mean, think about this, and this is one of the things I argue in my paper, because people will push back on this, that you are being too soft, is when we show students, when we're able to soften, one of my friends wrote a dissertation, he called it "To Soften the Ills of the World," was his title. If we're able to soften the impact of policies that might be hurtful, damaging, counterproductive, that's how we're exercising a cariño pedagogy. I mean, something as simple as, I'm happy you're here. I used to teach high school math. I don't think Eric mentioned this. Next time, Eric, no, just kidding. I taught in an alternative education setting. You know what that is? Continuation schools. Kids who have been kicked out of the regular public schools. And I would have I got this little pouch from Home Depot that had 2 pockets. And then I covered the Home Depot sign with a daily affirmation that I would write with the marker. And I would say stuff like, I'm happy you're here. Because the kids would come in with monitoring devices on their ankles. They hadn't eaten. Sometimes they're late to my class because they went to get an apple from the cafeteria. And I would come to them and be like, here's a pencil. Here's a bar, a snack bar. I'm happy you're here. Quietly. And they would look at me. And just that, instead of, why are you late? Go to the... That's what they were used to. But that's what the pedagogy of care, I'm happy you're here. Right? So what does this entail? I'm not going to go through all of it. You'll have access to the slides. Let me start over here. What we do as educators matters. We are the embodiment of cariño. Think about that. As educators, we are the walking, living, talking embodiment of care. This is where I talk about flexibility. Second, third, fourth chances to students. Rethinking subtractive practices like taking points away. When you provide flexibility, you model that compassion. Humanizing the interaction. Recognizing these high stakes moments, like every day in the classroom. Incorporating art into learning. But I kind of got sidetracked for a second. As educators, we are serving the next generation of leaders, the next generation of educators, the next generation of nurses, doctors. I don't know why I keep saying accountant, probably because I talked to my tax person earlier. The next generation of nonprofit leaders are right here, right? The next generation of coaches, those of you that are going to coach your child's teams in the community. I do that, not as much, but I value that. We are educating the next generation of people who will be in our position at one day. If we can exercise that cariño, that care, they will see what it's like to then hopefully exercise it to the next and pay it forward to the next generation. I think that's a key part of why it's so important to do that. That we are able to mitigate, soften what often seem like static policies, static practice, static syllabi, static approaches to teaching and learning, what it ultimately comes down to. And I think one of the things I highlight here is in the classroom, absolutely. But out of the classroom, CLEO, advising spaces, the library, student success, programming, tutoring, academic resource center, powerful spaces. One thing we learned, just a quick note about library. I've been engaged in a study since 2020 with some colleagues on Latino student success at our university. And one of the things that we found is that the library was such a vital resource for students. We had no idea until they told us in the surveys and explained to us why it was such a powerful resource. They needed, for practical reasons, I needed a quiet place to study. It was safe. I got to see my peers that I missed. When things started to open up, I'm talking about. And I was there, I had an opportunity to build community with my peers. The dean of the library didn't know, so when we shared this with him and his staff, they were just so like shining. They were just like so happy to hear that what they were doing mattered so much. They didn't know either. They didn't get any feedback, but they were providing such a critical resource service to the students. So that's, I wanted to make that point about in the classroom and out of the classroom. So closing thoughts. We see all the strengths that students bring in their mochilas. When students look in the educational mirror, they should never think that they're alone. They're never alone. Think about the mirrors, the mirror with the multiple mirrors and the person in the middle. They're never alone. Even when students are looking in the mirror at night, ready to go to sleep, and like, wow, what a tough day, and I have another one coming up tomorrow. They're never alone. They might be standing there alone, but our students should always feel through our pedagogy that we're there for them and they have a community of people around them. And that their families or whoever their loved ones are with them as well. Our students have far more in their backpacks and school supplies. They bring all of these strengths with them. And it's up to us to reflect excellence back to them. So when I think ultimately about the purpose of education and the power of pedagogy, I think about the purpose being who we are, who we were, and where we're going. So thank you. I'll stop there.